One of my patients once walked into my office completely overwhelmed. And this was someone who was graduating from college or about to graduate. And they had so many different things that they had to do, but couldn't even figure out where to get started. So they had a final project for one of their long classes that was going to go into their portfolio. They had other kinds of final exams coming up. They were also applying for jobs in graduate school, and they had a new dog that was actually sick and needed some care. And so they had all of these different things that they needed to do. And they were really, really confused why each thing that they needed to do became really, really important. And so they couldn't figure out why they couldn't even get started. And this was someone who had sort of been a serial procrastinator. And what they had sort of found is that, okay, as the deadline approaches, my motivation kind of goes up, and I end up, the weekend before the test, starting to study, I cram, and I end up doing okay. And so they were kind of confused that this had worked so far, right? That they had done, for years, they had sort of waited till the last minute, and when the urgency rises, they would actually start to act. But something wasn't working this time. Something had changed, that despite the fact that there were so many projects that were becoming more and more urgent, instead of actually getting into that mode of last-minute panic that gave them a burst of motivation, the opposite was happening. They felt more and more paralyzed. And the more that time ran out, they started feeling themselves locking down kind of more and more and more. And so they were terrified and weren't sure what to do, so they ended up coming to me. And this is where we sort of discovered a couple of very interesting things about how sort of the mind works when it comes to task completion, as well as some spiritual perspectives that were pretty helpful. So what I'd like to do today is introduce the concept of a cognitive drain. And the simplest way to understand this kind of from a scientific perspective is we can look at something as simple as memory. So if you kind of think about it, your mind will remind you of stuff, right? Which is kind of weird because even before it reminds you, and that's when you remember, what that sort of means is that it's keeping track in some way. So each task that you mentally kind of sign up for, some part of your mind is actually keeping track of. And what we sort of discover psychologically is that the more things that your mind is keeping track of, the less energy it has to actually complete actions. So if we think about your mind as having, let's say, 100 units of RAM, the more stuff that we're juggling, the more of your RAM is occupied subconsciously keeping track of all the stuff that you're doing. And the more that it's keeping track of stuff, the less space it has to actually do things. So another simple way to think about it is imagine that, I'm trying to complete a task with my hands. If my hands are holding a lot of stuff, it's actually hard for me to use the same hands that are holding things to actually complete tasks. My hands can either hold stuff or complete tasks. And our mind is actually the same way. And this is why we sort of see a couple of interesting phenomenon. The first is that checking something off from your task list actually gives you a burst of motivation. And the second thing is that the more our task list grows, the more overwhelming it becomes. And so this is the concept of a cognitive drain, which is sort of this idea that if we have a task that is uncompleted in our mind, it's actually going to tie up some of our cognitive energy. As our cognitive energy gets tied up by more and more tasks, we're actually left with less energy to actually do stuff. And this is what's so confusing for many people because as we get tied up with more and more tasks, things become more urgent, and we usually rely on urgency to give us motivation to complete tasks. So that's kind of from a cognitive perspective, but this is a principle that's well understood in the world of spirituality as well. So there's a very famous story about Buddha that after he became enlightened, someone came to him and said, hey, I'd really love to learn meditation from you. I've heard that you're the best teacher out there. I've studied for many, many years, and I'd really like to learn from you. And Buddha said, okay, fine. So this pupil came and sort of started to learn with Buddha, and months went by, and the pupil was starting to feel a little bit frustrated because he wasn't making progress. So he went to Buddha and he said, I'm not really making progress. What should I be doing differently? And Buddha said, okay, try this. And the pupil said, okay, fine. I know you're supposed to be the man and you're supposed to be an awesome teacher, so I'll do what you said. And so like months became years, and the pupil became more and more frustrated and went to Buddha time and time and time again and was saying, hey, like, this isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't working. And then finally 4 or 5 years went by, and the pupil went up to him and was very, very frustrated, and he said, I'm done with you. I'm finished. No more. You've actually wasted 5 years of my life. I came to you because you were supposed to be the best, and despite all of your instruction, I haven't advanced a single step. And then he spat in Buddha's face. And Buddha's other disciples, they got really upset. They were like, you can't be doing that. So they sort of stepped up and were about to give the guy a thrashing when Buddha tells them to kind of calm down, like take a step back. So the dude spits in Buddha's face, and then he like turns around and walks away, and Buddha says, let him go. And the disciples are really, really confused by this. And they're like, how could you let that dude disrespect you? You're the man, you're Buddha. And Buddha explained to them that this is just an incomplete karma that I have left. There was something from a past life, or maybe even something from this life, where this person had some kind of resentment that had built up, and he needed to like address that resentment. He needed to kind of wipe the slate clean. And if spitting in my face is what he needed to wipe the slate clean, then that's totally fine, and he's gone, like no big deal. And Buddha sort of explained this idea of like a karmic drain, that if you sort of make a promise to someone, or if you have a desire that is unfulfilled, that will be something that you essentially have to like finish off in some way. It's a checkbox that you have to complete. And this is something that we sort of know cognitively, right? If I tell myself, oh, I need to get milk, then my mind is going to keep track of that, and it's actually going to drain my energy a little bit, because some tiny corner of my mind is now spent in remembering that I need to get milk. And this is something that the yogis sort of observed, Buddha observed as well, and they almost said that this is a karmic energy. And actually, similar to cognition, that our incomplete desires are actually what causes us to get stuck in the cycle of birth and rebirth and actually traps us. Whichever perspective you take is kind of up to you. We're sort of sharing them because what we like to do is sort of look for scientific concepts that have spiritual support or vice versa. At the end of the day, one thing is pretty clear, that the more stuff you kind of sign up for in your mind, the bigger load it's going to be on your cognition, and potentially the bigger load it's going to be spiritually as well. And so if you're someone who's sort of stuck in this situation where you have 1,000 tasks to complete, and despite the fact that each of these is very, very important, is becoming more and more urgent by the day, if you find yourself being more and more paralyzed, understand that this is the principle of cognitive drains. Now, the natural question is, okay, cool, Dr. K, like this is a principle. I'm paralyzed because I have 1,000 things to do. Thanks for explaining it, but I'm still screwed, right? So don't worry, now we're going to get to, okay, what do you do about it? So the simplest thing, and this is where we can get guidance from both science and spirituality, the simplest thing to understand is that there are 2 ways to address a cognitive drain. One is through satisfaction, and one is through grief. So if we think about it, if I have a task to complete, let's say I need to buy milk on the way home, if I buy the milk on the way home, I check the box, right? I check it on my to-do list, and also the part of my mind that is remembering to buy milk reminds me to buy milk when I get in my car to go home for the day. That part of my mind then gets freed up. And that's really cool, because once it gets freed up, then I can point it at something else. I've gained a little bit of RAM, I've gained a little bit of energy, I've cleared some space in my hands to do other tasks. So this is why we sort of observed that, like, when I check one thing off of my to-do list, it actually can give me more energy to work on the other things. So the simplest thing you can do for a cognitive drain is to actually check off the box. Now the challenge is that, sort of telling people to just check things off their to-do lists is easier said than done, but there's another thing to consider as well. Because this principle of cognitive drains sometimes has tasks in our mind that we're not going to be able to complete, right? I wish I had 2 years ago spent a longer amount of time studying for that test. If I had studied more for that test, I wouldn't have that 1 F on my transcript. Now that I have that 1 F on my transcript, it's sort of like making life for me hard for me now. So there are a lot of actual karmic or cognitive drains that we simply can't check off. And this is the real thing to remember, is that if you're in that kind of situation, you can actually grieve that. And spiritually, this is what we sort of talk about when we sort of talk about letting go or detaching. And so if you've got this cognitive drain for a task that isn't simply, easy to check off, I wanted to start a business. I wanted to start a cupcake store or something like that. I wanted to run a food truck. We have all of these desires that even if you think about it, as the years go on, those desires keep popping up, right? I wouldn't be in this situation if I had started that food truck many years ago. Or you see someone else that starts the food truck that you were going to start, and they're really successful, and now their food trucks are all over the place. And each time you see one of those food trucks, some part of your mind goes back to that desire. And the thing is, this is what we accumulate as we live our life. Each desire that we have sort of burdens our mind a little bit more, occupies a tiny corner in our mind, fills up that space, and leaves us with less space to actually accomplish what we want. So there's even some interesting scientific evidence that as we unburden or grieve different parts of our life, that it actually helps us accomplish difficult cognitive tasks. And the best example of this actually comes from addiction. So when we're addicted to a substance, I want you all to understand that your biology, your brain is really, really craving that substance. And in order to overcome that addiction, we need a lot of willpower or a lot of cognitive strength. And so one of the really interesting discoveries that we sort of made by studying people who overcome addiction is that a lot of them will go through something called a 12-step process. And the interesting thing there is that one of the 12 steps is actually something called making amends. And so this is when you take someone, let's assume that they're an alcoholic, who stops and actually thinks about all of the people that they have wronged through their alcohol use. And then what they do is they start picking up the phone and they start making phone calls. Someone from 5 years ago where they were drunk and they messed up their lawn. So they'll actually go and sequentially think about all of the karmas that they've accrued, all of the negative karma that they've accrued, and they actually go back and make amends with each of those people. So they'll go track them down, they'll apologize to them, they'll sort of, they'll do whatever they can now to sort of fix the damage that they've done in the past. And you may sort of think that that's kind of weird, but what we actually find is that people who go through that process of making amends are more likely to become sober. And this is where that may seem weird, because what does apologizing to someone 5 years ago have to do with being able to resist having a beer the next time you go to a pool party? Those two objects seem completely unrelated. And in fact, what a lot of alcoholics who sort of struggle with addiction do is they deny the stuff from the past, right? They actually say forget about it, I'm never gonna apologize, I never did anything wrong. And those are the people who stay addicted. So we're not sure exactly how it works, but I think this principle of cognitive drains or karmic drains is actually borne out in terms of scientific outcomes, because the people who go through this process of unburdening their mind or unburdening their karma are actually more likely to be mentally stronger and overcome their addiction. So the nice words that you tell yourself you're going to say to other people, or the dreams that you let yourself dream, each of these is a karmic tie. And that's why in the cycle of reincarnation, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, each of our desires is actually viewed as a chain. So the book that you tell yourself you're going to write, the post that you want to make, or that action that you want to do for someone else, each of these things is a chain that binds you. And there are two ways to become unshackled from this. The first is to complete those desires, or the second is to grieve them.